Roger Fulshaw. Welcome to today's Let's Talk Politics, which is part of this year's special online virtual Féile, brought to you by Féile and Phobal in partnership with St Mary's University College and the Irish News. And to go through some of the main political events of this year, we have Tim Kearns, who is a Unionist commentator, we have the journalist Amanda Ferguson, and we have Irish News columnist Alison Morse, and I am David McCann from Slugger O'Toole. So to start off with the first topic, Tim, I'm going to go to you first. Lockdown, obviously, it's been the focus of politics the last 3 or 4 months. How do you think the executive has handled lockdown and performed?
Well, I think, when the lockdown first started, I think we saw some fractures within the executive at that point in time. Where were people looking east, west, north, south? And I think once we got over that bump, I think things were largely pretty good up until we had a few funerals along the way. And I think maybe that's where relations started to break down again at that point in time. And obviously we've got a much more fractured relationship now. But I think that period between the issue and around schools and the Bobby Storey funeral, I think the executive actually rose to the occasion, seemed to be acting as one, and I think it was quite refreshing and almost even, you might say, mature politics from our politicians that we haven't seen for quite some time. So apart from the bumps at the start and the more recent bumps, I think that middle period, I think we saw our executive functioning well. We maybe got a glimpse of how it could be if we got more mature politics here in Northern Ireland. So if you're going to score them on a scorecard, I think, maybe that middle period A, but the period at the start, maybe C-, and maybe now we're back in the D territory with the executive. But I think in terms of individual performances within the executive, I think, the standout performer was probably Arlene Foster. I think the RHI inquiry report coming at the very start of the lockdown, I think gave her certainly a confidence, gave her an air that, she was probably feeling like she was back, that she'd been held back for a while, but now the report, I think she felt vindicated her and largely it did. And I think, she felt that, she was back and was more confident, certainly was leading well. And I think you saw Arlene a renewed vigour within her. And I think obviously then Robin Swan as well. I think as health minister, he did the toughest job there within the executive. And I think Robin has, used the experience of Ulster Unionist Party leadership. You're under fire when you're in that position. And I think he used that well, used that to his advantage. And I think he's performed largely well as well.
Amanda?
I think that the differences of opinion that there were at the start of the process were actually okay. Like a lot of people were saying, they shouldn't be disagreeing with each other. And I was like, well, no, because if you believe something, then you should say it. So if Michelle O'Neill believed that schools should be closed, she should have said that. It was nice whenever the relationship between Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill was developing, and you could see that, from being sort of frosty, that there was an attempt to make it a little bit comradely. And I think that it was nice to see that kind of maturity, because it wasn't a question that Republicans felt that they had to follow what was happening in Dublin, or the Unionists felt they had to follow what was happening in London. It was very obvious that they were charting out their own course. This is our plan, and all that fake drama around the fact that we didn't have a calendar-led programme. I don't know how many sentences I wasted talking about that whenever it was obvious that nobody needed dates, and I think that's been borne out in the process. For me, whenever you're looking at the executive overall, I found the women more impressive, but maybe that's not surprising because that tends to happen in most areas of my life anyway. So I thought that Deirdre Hargey did a really good job as Communities Minister. We know she's off at the moment. She's been replaced by Carol McKillen, but I thought it was having a working class woman in that communities department was really useful. And if I could have a ministerial role, if I ever was in politics, although I have no plans to go into politics, communities would be a great department to have, because it covers so many areas. It's not just benefits or housing, it's sport and urban regeneration and museums and a whole variety. And it really gets to the heart of what is happening in communities. So I'll say Deirdre Hargey as one, and then as a second person, I'm actually going to say Arlene and Michelle as one, because one doesn't exist without the other. So that would be my kind of second. And I think that the person whose job I would least want to have would probably be Peter Weirs, because education has been such a political football during this process that I just wouldn't want to be anywhere near that portfolio. And for me, for the health ministry, which is obviously one of the important ones when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic, Robin Swan started off very calm and assured, and it is a difficult portfolio to take care of. I feel he's been disappointed around women's reproductive rights. He hasn't shown any sort of great leadership there, so that would be sort of minus points on that for me. And then, with finance, I don't think particularly in finance or agriculture that the men have really had much opportunity to shine. And I'm bored of hearing about Conor Murphy's PPE order that wasn't. But it was nice to see someone like Edwin Poots, he's kind of doing his own thing, solo runs to a certain extent, out on the river, clearing up, rubbish himself. And I think that for the other portfolios, people like Nicola Mallon and Naomi Long and Diane Dodds, if I kind of just put their head down, gone out, spoken to people about the issues that are important to the particular portfolio that they're leading. And it's been interesting as well, watching economy, kind of Diane Dodds surrounding herself by experts, which I think is the right thing to do. People who know the economy, who know business, who are working within industries in Northern Ireland. So I think that's been something that's good to do. And it's been interesting because we haven't heard much from Nigel Dodds since he lost the North Belfast seat to John Finucane. And a lot of what I can see from his online presence is him retweeting a lot of the economy ministry's output. So it's kind of sweet to see that family relationship being part of the social media output. But I think overall they've done not a bad job.
Okay, overall.
Although the horror show will be to come,
Okay.
at the other side of it.
So kind of starting off well and dipping down, Amanda's going with a positive there. Alison, how do you think the executives performed?
Look, I think nobody expected to come in. When they went in January, they were sort of forced in because of the health service waiting list. They didn't expect then, nobody did, to be thrust into a pandemic. And as a politician, I don't think anyone would have wanted this, but, to prove your sort of mettle as a politician, what better way to do it? I did think that both Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill, I thought, did brilliantly. I did like I know that they felt that the community, that, the public were nervous, they were anxious. And so that, standing shoulder to shoulder, albeit 2 meters apart, and using each other's first names when they were addressing each other, all of that, it became very reassuring. And I'll tell you what, I do think that helped both of them. The fact that they had to stand alone, the fact that the pandemic meant that they had to give those press conferences alone, and we removed all those men who stood around behind them. If there's one thing that annoys me in politics, it's those donuts, of people who stood behind politicians when they're making a statement. For Michelle O'Neill specifically, because she had come under fire so much at the start of when she was taking the deputy leader's position, and there was the accusation of being anointed, the fact that she was being controlled, by this backroom men. When you took all them away, you could see she was entirely capable of standing on her own 2 feet, of speaking for herself. I think that both of them showed a great deal of compassion. Arlene probably has always had a reputation of that sort of snarling reputation, that she was always, quite frosty. But there was a human side come out to her then, and I thought a very compassionate side. I remember watching the Daily Briefing the day where they said that they were going to change the legislation to allow a wedding to take place because there was a lady who was terminally ill who wanted to get married, and she was, quite emotional making that. And I thought that showed a human side there, which people like. They want to know that their politicians are actually real people. When it comes to judging the rest of them, I will agree that at the very beginning, and I know that she's off ill at the minute, receiving some treatment, but Deirdre Hargey did brilliantly because she didn't wait around. She didn't wait around for people to advise her, consult her. She just went, this is going to be disastrous for people on low incomes. Let's change the way universal credit applies. Let's hand out these grants. Let's make sure money's available to people who are, in real dire straits, of which a lot of people were during lockdown. Peter Weir, I think, has yet to show us exactly what it is he's made of. Schools and teachers need proper answers as to how they're going to operate when the kids come back in September. And at this point in time, I know from many teachers I've spoke to, they get different advice, week after week. They need to actually sit down and go, this is what's going to happen in September. That's what we're sticking to. And he needs to show some backbone in that respect. I think Robin Swan's in trouble come when there will be an inevitable inquiry into coronavirus, and that's obviously going to take into consideration what happened in the nursing homes. I think he might be in bother there because the fact is that we had the benefit of hindsight. We could see what was happening in nursing homes in Spain and in Italy, and should have been prepared for it. And that question about not testing people who were being sent from hospital, taking hospital patients and chucking them into a nursing home full of vulnerable pensioners, really, as we have known now, is what caused those clusters. And I think that he was working in very difficult circumstances. It wasn't a job that anyone wanted, even without the pandemic, let's face it. The Ulster Unionists took that position because nobody was putting their hand up to take on health. He had a body of work trying to get rid of, 300,000 waiting lists before that even started. But a lot of it, I think there was a lot of dithering. And at some stages, he didn't want to look like he was following Dublin's lead. But then you could see how disastrously, Boris Johnson's policies were playing out in England. So he didn't want to be seen to be following them. And so there's a bit of dithering what way will it go before he actually devised his own sort of programme with that. I think that at one stage, I know there was an interview in the Irish News from Michelle O'Neill where she had said that she wanted universal testing in all nursing homes. There was a delay in implementing that. So I think that those delays, when we come to the point in time where there is an inquiry into what happened in nursing homes during coronavirus, those delays I don't think will shine favourably on anyone who was involved in that. I think that Diane Dodds' work has yet to come. So economy wasn't much use when everything was locked down, because what are you doing? But her work is now the fact that we're going to have to try and rebuild the economy. So we're going to have to see what she is, what she has about her. So she spent all those years in Europe and all those years in Brussels. Let's hope she made plenty of contacts while she was there, because she's going to need all the investment and help she can get. So her body of work, I think that I know that there was to do with small business grants, but her actual work starts now in the rebuilding. Edwin Poots' work is going to start come January, when the Brexit that his party voted for and campaigned for kicks in, and that's when the agri-food sector is going to come under checks and balances in relation to that, and I think that that's when his real work's going to start. So I don't think we can judge them all and say they all got an A during that time. Some definitely performed better than others, and I think that what it required was bravery. So instead of being afraid of making a decision, going, I'm not sure how this is going to work out, the ones who just went, well, let's make this decision. If it doesn't work, we'll go back and fix it, and just ploughed on. I think they will be the ones that will be judged better when we look back at this with hindsight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I think Deirdre Hargey has been a standout performer. I want to go to Tim on this, because I'll be interested in both Alison and Amanda's perspective on this as well. There's been a reference in the joint press conferences that we've had between Michelle O'Neill and Arlene Foster, and of course some of the other ministers supplementing that throughout the week. Now, we've never had so much media exposure for the heads of our government before, where every week and they would do interviews on top of that. What did you make of them? For me, they kind of they petered out pretty quickly in terms of their usefulness. But what did you make of the joint press conferences?
Well, I think, they certainly did very well. I mean, as has been said already, I think there was a certain warmth that seemed to be growing between them at that point in time. And I think, there seemed to be a thawing. If you think back to, the height of RHI and the height of the 3-year hiatus, and, we were hearing from Michelle O'Neill how, manners needed to be put on the DUP and arrogance needed to be challenged, and, all of this rhetoric. And, Arlene on the other side of that calling people crocodiles and snarling at press conferences, and you would think, how can these two ever work together? But it seemed that there was certainly a thawing of hostilities, and I think there was certainly a warmth that had started to develop between them, and I don't know where that goes now in the aftermath of what we've been dealing with for the last month or so, as to where does that relationship pick up again? Does it pick up again? And I think a lot of what had been gained in that time has been lost. So I think it's been good, and it's been good to see that Arlene and Michelle can work together. And I wonder, is that when we get through the pandemic, when we get into normal politics, when we get over, inquiries in Belfast City Council and all of those sorts of things, when we get through all of that, are we going to see that relationship come back and be warm again? I actually think probably not. I think we'll probably go back to Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill not really being able to work together in any meaningful way. And I think we'll be back to hiatus, and I think we'll be back to, the problems we have. I'm not desperately optimistic that come this time next year, everybody will be hand in hand in Stormont Castle holding hands together and hugging each other once the 2 metre distancing's gone, and aren't we great friends, and everyone's all loving each other now. I think we'll be back to crises. But at least there'll be a certain sense of normality in that, won't there? We maybe long for the happy days of Ryan and crises.
So optimistic, Tim.
Well, I don't want to be like sort of some kind of Alex Kane tribute act or something here. But I feel like I'm almost going down that road. I just don't see any way that we come through this, and the warmth that we've seen in April, May, and June this year between Michelle O'Neill and between Arlene Foster and between the wider executive of everybody working together. Look, we saw a few fissures and a few cracks along the way, didn't we? When we had the infrastructure minister was coming and saying we need face masks on buses. And she brought the proposal, and we see the joint chairs of the executive quietly just dropped it off. It was almost like you could have been going back to Danny Kennedy's day or whomever from the smaller parties where things were just quietly dropped off the agenda of the executive. So we see there that the DUP and Sinn Féin will work together when it's in their interest to work together. A little row when it's in their interest to row. And I don't know, I just don't think that see any great optimism coming through this.
Okay. Amanda, I know you have had a great interest in the joint press conferences that have gone on. So what do you think? I know they're off, but what do you think about them? Do you think they served any useful purpose?
Yes, I did. I think that they were something interesting. They were something new. They were something where you knew you had to have ministers in place. And journalists don't ask questions always expecting to get an answer to their question. But what it provided was the opportunity for public scrutiny. And even if they didn't answer the question, at least they were asked it in public and you had a note of what was being said, so you can go back to them at a later date about it. I think that Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill, for me, are like a couple that should be divorced, but they're staying together for the sake of the children because they think that's the right thing to do, and it's probably not. I don't think that we're going to ever have a Chuckle Brothers scenario. I don't think it's ever going to be like Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, and that's all right. That's okay. But I think what we're experiencing at the moment with the fallout row is a little bit of theatre, and I think it'll probably calm down in the next couple of weeks. Regarding the future of the press conferences, they were dropped from 5 days a week to 3, which is understandable because we're not, in that sort of daily peak. We're in a different place. July, August isn't March, April. So, that's okay. But whenever I was speaking to the First Ministers and asking them questions at those press conferences, I purposely raised, press access, press scrutiny and all of those things. And it was made very clear to me that they were enjoying the format and that they were actually considering, I think it was Arlene Foster said that post-COVID, they would like to continue it because they were finding it useful as a useful way to communicate with the public. But, in recent days, they're completely off the agenda. And I think it shows the executive's contempt for journalism and also for the wider public, as if it's okay just to immediately stop doing these sort of press events and then hand selecting journalists to talk to. I think that there's been too much control over recent years and too many sort of optics pressers that do my head in. So this is one of my bugbears and something that I will continue to raise because it is important that people know what's going on.
Okay. Alison, I know you were writing plenty of columns and plenty of pieces about
They were bloody rubbish, those press conferences. I mean, this is the whole point. I will also tell you that when I was doing them, there's days I did those press conferences with pajamas on the bottom and just dressed myself from the waist up, like to do the Zoom call. So I was like, frig this, I'm not getting friggin' dressed. I said, look, of course they enjoyed them because it was so controlled. It was micromanaged within an inch of its life. You don't have you there. You can't see the whites of their eyes. You can't challenge them. Go, hold on 1 second. That's actually not right. What about X, Y, and Z? It was all so managed, and for them, that was, it was basically copying the Downing Street model, and that was Boris Johnson trying to control the media in England. I know that we were in exceptional circumstances and we couldn't all go tracking up to Stormont at that time. Those days are now gone. We can easily have socially distanced press conferences where we can sit a few seats apart and we can ask them questions and where you can challenge them if they don't answer your question. And I think that is a much better way of holding them to account. But I do think that streaming that then live on Facebook was a good idea because people who don't have access to those kind of things, and people that were interested, they're generally interested in what was happening. So I think that part of it, maybe you could keep, but the rest of it, I think, that is the easiest cop-out for a politician ever. Put someone on a Zoom call, let them ask a question, mute their mic so they can't come back to you again, answer a question which is, give them an answer which bears no resemblance to the question they asked, and let's all move on with their lives. So, no, I don't think that there's any value in keeping that on. I do think there's value in keeping maybe a weekly briefing that people can go up and put questions to them. And I do think that ministers clearly need to make themselves more available to the press. The public give us grief in saying, why don't you ask them this and why don't you ask them that? If you knew the hoops you have to jump through, like to get in contact with these people, and to try and get them to sit down and speak to you, it is not the easiest. You put requests and requests and requests in, and you have to scream and stamp your feet to get access to them. And then when you do, it's usually in the presence of press officers and in a very controlled manner. So no, I think it's better that we go back to the way it was, and we'd go up and have maybe a weekly briefing, I don't know. But I think that we need to be, if they're going to answer questions from a journalist, the journalist needs to be in the room with them. Putting a journalist on the other end of a camera is a cop-out, like it really is.
Definitely, but Dublin were much better at this in terms of the amount of access they had to the chief medical officer, to politicians. There was the government
They
press
just had a better
conference,
chief medical
and there
officer,
was-
didn't they? Let's face it.
There was the chief medical officer doing the health department briefing. There was the politicians, and it was a constant flow of information. And you heard that from the World Health Organization. They were like, you have to have people on board. You have to build trust. They have to be able to trust what you're saying. And I've just found the approach that Stormont has got, it's just been too insular, too guarded, too controlled. Needs must. So at the time, there was no other way to get access to people. And there is, as Alison was saying, there is a format there where it's useful to have it live and have it streamed. And I think that they didn't deal particularly well with the more challenging questions and the more direct questions. And as I said, you're not always expecting an answer to those, but I think it's nice to put people on the spot and just see what they're made of in a live environment like that.
And also just going back, because I know you were writing a lot about this, do you think the powers that the executive now got through the coronavirus legislation, and if you actually go through and read bits of it, they are quite extensive.
I suggest that everybody reads that legislation. It is insane. Like it would put, it would literally send chills down your spine. It is, when you say draconian, people use the word draconian too often. It is fucking draconian, like it really is. And what I think that what we have is nobody objected to it. It's insane that in any other time, that politicians would allow that legislation to pass without scrutiny and without exercising it. I realise we were living in exceptional times, but what we have to do now as journalists, it's our duty to monitor and make sure that does disappear, and as it was meant to be with the sunset clause, because I can guarantee you there's aspects of that legislation that they're going to try and keep because it just makes things easier for them. There's no need for public consultations. You can close any departments down now without asking the public or having a consultation about it, because literally that's it under coronavirus legislation. You don't have to have inquests into people's deaths. People can be sectioned without even, having to be signed off. They could come in here now and take you away and lock you up, and nobody could do anything to you. And why none of us would object? It wouldn't be very nice for you. There's aspects of it in relation to care for people who are mentally ill and care for. So there's loads of aspects of that legislation which need to go as soon as possible. It should only be kept until it's necessary. I actually would argue that the majority of that legislation is no longer necessary. They pass through very quickly in relation to public assembly. That's to stop. If we're going into a period of economic downturn and governments are going to start implementing austerity and all sorts of other things, you can implement legislation that prevents people taking to the streets and demonstrating, and I don't think that that's the way you want to carry on in any kind of a democracy.
I think it's an important point, because I think we talk about the executive and whether they performed badly or poorly or whatever, and we've all got opinions on who performed well and who didn't. I think universally it's probably accepted the police performed badly, not just here but across the United Kingdom and beyond, because the police took these powers and they went way beyond even the spirit of what the legislation was, and then we're doing things that were
Police
absolutely
and Easter
nuts.
egg.
An Easter egg's not essential.
Non-essential eggs in supermarket. I don't even know what that is. What
I
is
know.
the non-essential egg in a
And
supermarket?
the video, I think it was in Yorkshire, wasn't it, where there was a woman was sunning herself in her front garden, and the police said you can't be in your front garden. You got to be in the back garden.
I will say, in fairness, the PSNI, they weren't as bad as some of those police forces in England,
Sure.
and I'll tell you the reason why is we have always had quite draconian powers here. The PSNI have always had the ability to implement powers that just wouldn't be acceptable in other parts of the UK, and so therefore they were quite relaxed about the whole thing.
Some of the stuff around exercise, I think the PSNI were not.
Nobody else, you see, because most of it was guidance and it wasn't legislation, and the fact is what was legal and what wasn't legal, and I think that there was no clarity on it at all. But there were some, wee forces in England who, just were power hungry. They were just drunk on power with this legislation, and you could see that.
No doubt. And I think, you saw the police, in England with loud hailers, not essential. But there was some of that spilled over here. And I think, I think the police, and I'm maybe going to say something controversial here, but I think the other group that I don't think is going to come out well out of all of this is actually teachers. And I think I know Amanda's shaking her head disagreeing, but as a parent,
we'll let you get back.
But as a parent, I think teachers have performed exceptionally badly in this. I think teacher unions have performed exceptionally badly in all of this. This idea that the teachers are working 24-hour days and all of this sort of thing. I never saw that as a parent. We had very minimal contact with the primary school that my daughter goes to. Now, it was much better with the secondary school, the grammar school that my son goes to. We had much more contact with them, and I think it was a lot better there. But that's there's maybe reasons for that. But they have the highest fees in Northern Ireland in that grammar school, so you got to get something for your $3,000, I guess. But
$3,000 first.
but I think teachers are coming out of this very poorly. I think we see teachers, there's a reluctance to just get back into the classroom. I think we see teachers are not prepared to
But can
go
you
that
understand
extra
why
mile.
though, Tim?
No, I don't. I don't understand why. No, I don't. Because we're all going back to work. We're all going in the offices. We're all emerging from lockdown, and there just seems to be this absolute reluctance on the part of teachers to get back to it, to be able to be, because I think that childcare element that the teachers perform. If the economy is going to reopen, if we're going to get back to some sort of normal, then schools have to reopen. Schools have to get back to normal. Schools have to be there for pupils to go to those schools so parents can go back and work. And I think if teachers keep going down the course that they're going down, I think that we're going to see teachers emerge from lockdown in a really unpopular way.
Amanda.
There's a lot to unpack there. I think with regards to the police, I had concerns about their response to the Black Lives Matter protests in relation to some other public demos that have taken place. But I think the police were in the same position that everybody else was in, that nobody knew what was happening. Everybody was frightened and all of those things. So I think that maybe some of the criticism of them is a little bit unfair, and definitely the criticism of teachers is unfair. Teachers aren't babysitters. Teachers have to take into consideration health and safety. And my go-to person, expert on the pandemic, is Mike Ryan, the World Health Organization's executive director. He's a great communicator. He's very clear whenever it comes to schools that it shouldn't be used as a political football. It can't be, sort the schools, sort one area, sort another area. It has to be a holistic approach. The schools and teaching shouldn't be used as a political football. To get kids back to school, we need low community transmission, and that's up to everybody. That's up to us all, and the behaviours that we have around face coverings and respiratory etiquette and washing your hands and all that sort of stuff, all the stuff that we know is going to keep people safe. But I know from speaking to teachers and speaking to teaching unions that they were doing, of course there were teachers who weren't, that interested and weren't doing a lot of work, but there were loads of people who were working around the clock, and they were going outside of their remit to try and help families. And, the trade unions have been very clear on this. Teachers are employees as well. They'll go back to work whenever it's safe to do so, and it's safe for the children that are in their care to do so. And I think that what we'll see is a mixture of home and Zoom and all of those things. But I don't understand why anybody would expect a solution now to something that's going to be happening in August and September, because we don't know where we're going to be with the pandemic in August, September, October. So I think
teachers aren't babysitters, but I think we're getting sick of teachers whinging. I think we need to have a can-do attitude.
Well, maybe
in this.
you are, Tim.
You
can't weigh that one. I'm not sick of teachers.
I'm sick of them. I'll speak for myself. I'm absolutely sick of their whinging. I think we need a can-do attitude in this. We're either in this. It seems we're all in this together, except if you're a teacher. Oh, I'm not. I can whinge, and that's fine.
You find it homeschooling difficult, Tim?
Well, I didn't do any homeschooling. My wife did it, she's a much better teacher than I am.
Say no more.
But I think there's no question. There's absolutely no question that we need to hear a bit more of a can-do attitude from teachers' unions. All I'm hearing is can't, no.
Alison, what do you think about? Obviously, this linked into the journey out of lockdown, but what do you think about how certain sectors are responding?
I think my sister's a teacher, and she is at work. She's been at work. There's children. She works in severely special needs children, and so she's been at work teaching them. I know that other people who I'm friends with who are teachers have been working flat out and have been very distressed. But I also know that they will tell you that some of their colleagues have not been working flat out and going once a week and put a happy face beside the child's work on Seesaw and then go away back about whatever it is they're doing. So it's not universal. I think that some have went above and beyond, and some have seen it as an extended holiday. But I do think that the problem is that children, and especially children from very deprived communities, children who are maybe living at home with addicts, children who are maybe carers within their own home. I've heard some absolute horror stories. We know that the number of kids that are being referred for, who have been flagged up to social services has reduced, and that's because there's no teacher to see them. So if you have a child who's in a house where people are partying or taking drugs all weekend, they come into school on a Monday in a distressed state, the teacher will see that and they'll be able to flag it up. No one is seeing those children. And I know that some teachers will tell me there's children that haven't logged on once in the whole time, or that a child will say, I'm sorry, there's so many mistakes in my working with, I'm trying to do it on my mummy's phone. They haven't a laptop, they haven't an iPad, they've access to nothing. And so lockdown, I think, for children who live in lovely, happy, current, warm homes where the mother's getting up or the father's getting up and trying to homeschool them every day, they probably love this time off. But their children live in absolutely horrific lives who will never catch up. I don't care what anyone says, they'll never catch up. They were already behind anyway. They were already at a disadvantage because of where they come from. They were already at a disadvantage because of just for circumstances that were nothing to do with them, just societal circumstances that mean the kids from working class communities and kids from deprived communities do worse. And those kids, I think, are the ones who are being really let down. And I think that what the education minister needs to do is he needs to say, this is what's happening in August and September. Because if you're a working parent, you need to know, because you need to be able to tell your employer when you can come back to work. This is what's going to happen. The schools, and it should it be, your child's going to be in school 3 days a week, your child's going to be, just tell us. Tell the teachers, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen come September. And that's what you're going to do because that's your job. And let's all then work towards that. But I think that the fact is, and I know even from my own sister will tell you that it changes, the advice that they get changes. So at one stage or two it's saying you'll have to keep all the kids in your class in one bubble. And then it'll be you have to, only bring in half of them once a week and half of them the next week. And that doesn't work. You can't just do a black and white plan because every child has different needs and every child will require different needs. And when you're dealing with kids with very complex needs, those children need 5 days a week in school. They've already missed enough school without sending them into school 2 days a week and telling them to go back on, their mum's freaking mobile. The rest of the time they're trying to do online schoolwork. It's a nonsense.
I agree with Alison wholeheartedly. I'm in a very lucky position where my kids have a mum who's ferocious. I think that my kids want to get back to school because the teachers are softer than the one at home, And we have technology for our kids and we can do all of that. What about the children, as Alison has said, who are not logging in, who have not done one day schoolwork since, and we've also got AQE and GL coming up in November. What's going to happen for those kids? And how are they going to catch up to be able to do those exams? And I think, there's no leadership coming forward in that. I think with the AQE and GL, what we're hearing from the education authorities, be it the minister down, is those are tests that are run privately by private companies. We have no influence. We have nothing to say on
School
that.
principals just want a plan. They just say, give me a plan.
Absolutely.
Tell me what's going to happen, and then we'll go and do it. And
There needs to be some leadership in this, and there needs to be some leadership, I think, from principals as well. I don't think it's good enough for principals just to simply say,
Tim,
we're waiting for the plan to come to us. Plan for your own school.
Tim, just ask this, and then we'll go to Amanda, bring Amanda back in on this. Do you not think that leadership has to start from ultimately the top, and ultimately the direction has to come from someone?
I do think the education system, there's been a failure. I mean, I've had a big rattle at teachers, but I think there's also been a political failure as well. I think whether that's the bureaucrats in the education authority, whether that comes from the minister's office, I think there has to be leadership. I don't think it's good enough for principals simply to sit there and say, we're waiting for it to come down on high. Start to plan for your own school. But I do think, in fairness to principals, there has been a lack of a plan coming from the top to set an agenda, to set the parameters. Principals need parameters to work in, and then they need to get the specifics sorted for their own schools. And I do think there's been a failure from top, which is flowing down to the bottom.
Amanda.
I think that with the limitations that are in place at the moment, there's no way you could deliver a full curriculum. There's no way you could have full exams. It just wouldn't be possible. So I think we are going to have to wait a while longer to see what happens and see where we are whenever it comes around to term times. Bright children are going to be fine. They'll be able to catch up, and it'll be no bother. But I know that measures have been put in place over the summer for different kinds of summer schemes to try and get people who are behind caught up. But it is going to be difficult. And I think that the Children's Commissioner, Kulu Suma, has been very clear. The priority whenever we get all the children back into schools is to see how they are, because, sitting on your Xbox and having barbecues out the back in the big house and all the rest of that, those kids will be fine, but there'll have been a lot of damage done over the last couple of months. And the priority isn't around getting back, day one of books open. It'll be just making sure that the kids are okay.
So the way there's kids bouncing around to Joe Wicks and making pizza, there's other children sitting in a house with no food, and a parent with mental health problems or a parent with addiction problems. And those children have been at home for long enough. Do you know what I mean? That's enough. That is enough. That's neglect, and I think it's a societal neglect, and something needs to be done, because at the end of the day, you're literally ruining young people's lives. We know that they're at very low risk from coronavirus, so we're not trying to save them for that. But what are we trying to save them for? We're trying to save them from abuse and from neglect and from a whole future of having failed educationally and feeling like a failure just because nobody stepped in and did anything.
And we definitely need to invest more in the social care part of health and social care, because, where are the increased social workers that are going to be required to deal with the variety of issues that are coming down the line here? It's...
Okay. So I'm going to move on to another topic. Thank you for the great exchanges there. We have a new government, believe it or not. There was a general election in February in the south, which seems to be a world ago now. A new government was formed after finally 4 months. It's a Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Green Party coalition. Micheál Martin is Taoiseach for 2.5 years. Mary Lou McDonald takes up takes up post as leader of the opposition. I'm going to work my way back around and start with Alison. Alison, what do you think about the new Irish government? How does that change the dynamic of the North-South relationship and just kind of the wider political conversation on the end?
It's interesting, because when you looked at the programme for government, while it was meant to be, uniting the island programme for government, there was more in there about the relationship between Dublin and London. And you can see that that's with a priority. They feel that relationship was damaged during the Brexit talks. And this current coalition is more interested in trying to make amends there than they are in what happens north of the border. And the fact remains that Sinn Féin are in opposition. They're political rivals to both Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, and they're in government in the north. So they're not going to want to give anything to Northern Ireland to be seen to be given a helping hand or a hand up, or to make Sinn Féin appear good in the south and the southern media, when that's going to be detrimental to them. I think that the reason why that election was the way it was, and the reason why we, for the first time since the formation of that state, have a three-way split within those parties, is because of the social issues that existed in the south, specifically, I think, in relation to housing, which was the biggest one, and the way people are forced to live, and the homeless problem. And I think that all of that came in, and I can't see how, the two parties that basically caused that are going to be able to fix that. That's the issue there. I think for Sinn Féin being in opposition is probably a good place for them to be in. I mean, let's face it, they didn't box very clever with that election, because they didn't run enough candidates. Had they run enough candidates, at this point in time, Riley McDonald would probably be Taoiseach, and that's just the truth. But they didn't. So the fact is, they messed up there. So now what they're going to have to do is trying to build in the areas where they didn't run candidates. They're going to have to try and move people into the community and trying to build up an electoral base there. And what they're going to have to do is sit back and hope that this government fails, because if it continues the way it's going on, if it continues the way it was before lockdown, and we've also got a recession and coronavirus to deal with, I think that Leo Varadkar being a doctor and, doing his Independence Day moment and put the scrubs back on, and I'm going back into
he had a resurgence during, because you wouldn't have thought he'd come third. You wouldn't have thought he'd come third.
That's why, being a doctor in a medical pandemic, is quite a good position to be in. And so it's supposed to give people a renewed trust in him, when clearly they didn't have that before the election. So you have a bounce from that, but that's not going to last. The fact is that if we go back into savage austerity, which the South has suffered enough of, let's face it, they suffered, almost a decade of that kind of austerity. If we go back into that, and if we go back into a situation where the housing crisis increase, where there's new homes aren't built, where landlords are continued allowed to exploit their tenants in the way that they have been, well then no, it's not going to. And I think I'll tell you who it is disastrous for. I don't think it'll do Sinn Féin any harm sitting in the opposition benches for the next few years, but I think for the Green Party, I think it was a disastrous move to go into that government, because that government is not going to implement the kind of policies that are going to appeal to Green Party voters. And we've seen this before, when small parties and liberal parties like that go into coalitions like that, it wipes them out, it destroys them.
Amanda,
I think it's a pretty spicy scenario that we found ourselves in. It's kind of like a new dispensation, and the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Green link up. And I think that Claire Bailey, the Green leader in the North, did the right thing to say, I'm not really fussed on this deal, but I'm going to support my colleagues to an extent. So she has set out her stall, I think, identifying that it's an all-island structure within the Greens. What happens on either side of the border. It's not as if people don't look and see what's happening. So I think that even though there was criticism of the Green Rebels, I think it was probably smart of her to do that. So at least whenever they're out knocking doors up here, they can say, well, that wasn't really, us to a certain extent. I think that Sinn Féin in opposition is interesting, and I think that it does them no harm at all. I think that it sets them up very well for the next election that we have. I can't believe how long it took. I was down in Dublin in February covering the election results, and then for the many months that have dwindled on, my editors and international publications of the Irish government, is there any sign of that happening anytime soon? And I was like, it takes a bit of time in these necks of the woods. But it was interesting, Micheál Martin's first visit north as Taoiseach, he very much focused on the British-Irish relationship. I tried to probe, what are you going to be raising with Boris Johnson about Northern Ireland? And there wasn't that much coming out the other side, because I think that people tend to care about things whenever it affects them, and Brexit obviously affects the whole island of Ireland, both jurisdictions. So I think that the North isn't necessarily going to be that much of a focus of attention, although I think from the soundings that were coming out from the political parties, and we know all about the North-South Ministerial Council raising its head after 3 years, it's promising that relationships could be decent enough. And you can see Micheál Martin's trying to take on that, co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement role rather than as the Fianna Fáil leader. But you can see how that's difficult, for him and for Sinn Féin. And then there's the relationship.
Micheál Martin fucking hates Sinn Féin. He's not going to do anything to help them whatsoever.
Yeah, but
this is going to be the most hostile opposition.
Yeah, but
ever.
the other day, whenever he was talking, he was very clear about the fact that he was there as the Taoiseach, and he was being challenged on, why aren't you being more critical of Sinn Féin? But how long that lasts for remains to be seen. But I think that the next Southern election could have major implications for both jurisdictions on this island.
Well, listening to you three gibber on is probably about the most I've cared about Irish politics in a long time.
What would you? So obviously there was just to ask you about this, because obviously one of the first things that Micheál Martin was slated about was Ian Marshall not being reappointed to the Irish Senate, the lack of a unionist voice. Tim, you're a unionist yourself.
Who cares? The only thing I know about Irish politics is that Micheál Martin, he doesn't seem a bad fella to me. I think he's all right.
His friend.
I think he's all right. I like him.
My enemy's enemy.
How do unionists? So unionists don't care about the Senate, but how do you think the average unionist is interpreting?
I don't think there's one unionist who's lost any sleep about whether there's a unionist in the Senate or not, other than Ian Marshall and whatever it is, 55 grand or whatever it is you get paid to be in the Senate. I can see why he's upset, because look, I don't think if there's a unionist there, good luck to them, take the money, and if you want to go down there, good luck to you. If there's no unionist there, what does it matter? Doesn't matter. But I think it is important to be serious for a second. It is important, that there is good relations between here and down there. I mean, whether we like it or not, we do have to have a relationship that works. And I think, particularly, with the way things are going to go over the next couple of years with Brexit and all of that, I do think it is important that there's cordial relationships north-south. And I also think it's important that nationalists, I think, need to realise this, that there needs to be good relations east-west as well. We need to coexist on this island. And I think it's important that Northern Ireland and the executive here and their counterparts down south have a working relationship together. I think beyond that, I don't think any unionists care. North-south bodies, unionists in the Senate. If I'm reading a newspaper and there's an article on Republic of Ireland politics, turn the page and read Allison's column. That's bound to be more interesting, so it is. So I think for most unionists, it's not something that they lose a wink of sleep over.
Okay. Amanda, you want to come back in?
I think that it's good that people are talking about shared Ireland rather than united Ireland. And I think that unionists are going to have to care eventually. I think because of the way the political direction of the island's going, and all the calls that are happening for a border poll and all of those things, I think it's good even for reconciliation purposes. it's okay for there to be all island solutions to things. We've seen that with Children's Heart Services. We've seen that with other things as well. So I think that there's maybe more of a maturity there than there previously was. And I don't think that Tim's alone in not having much interest or understanding of Southern politics, because there's some Republicans and there's some nationalists who haven't got a clue what's going on the other side of the border either. And we know a variety of the reasons for why that happens. But I think that to not have a Northerner on the nomination list for the Senate, I think was a mistake. It wouldn't have particularly mattered who it was. It's more, it's not so much that unionists care about whether someone was nominated or not, or not. It's more about what does it say about what the Irish government not bothering to nominate someone. I think the only person maybe from the north is Eileen, up in Donegal. Well, sorry. She's not part of Northern Ireland, but you know what I'm talking about. So it's, and even the geographical spread of where all of the TDs are from, we've seen the map, we've seen Dublin and Cork and other scatterings. So I think that maybe if there was a system where it was Ulster, Munster, Leicester, Connaught, and you had more of a spread of representation, that might be better.
I know nothing, but I thought Niall O'Donoghue was on the Senate.
Alicia McCallion is as well. But you see the election, so you have like a nominated.
So, but what then? I'll go to you on this, Alison. Obviously we're talking about the Shannon. There were a lot of Northerners very disappointed who didn't get in there. So Ian Marshall, you had Emma D'Souza as well. You had all these people who are, and as Amanda was pointing out, that they're typically in that nomination list. There was a seat typically kept aside for someone from the north.
It's self-promotion by a lot of people, because the benefits, from being in the Shannon, I don't think are that great. I think that the benefits from North-South bodies, I think that the benefits from North-South cooperation, but in a lot of ways, it's not a role that can bring any real change. So it is more symbolic than anything else. I think it was a nice gesture to have a unionist sitting there. I think from a unionist perspective, as you said, they don't care. In fact, they probably prefer it, because they don't want in any way to strengthen the bonds between North and South to them. Keep us, we're two separate places, keep the border down the middle, you keep yours and we'll keep ours. But so I do think from that point of view, but I think it gave out a signal as to where the priorities are from this coalition government. And I can assure you, there's certainly not in trying to strengthen any kind of relationships with Northern Ireland. Micheál Martin is desperate to get his wee self over to Downing Street so he can do plenty of schmoozing up to Boris Johnson, but I think that's his main priority.
Well, he's only going to be there for 2.5 years. 2021, he's gone in December. He switches over to Leo. Leo comes back.
But then you have the anniversary of the formation of the state and all of that, and what comes with that, and that's those centenaries are very important. I think they're important to unionists and they're important to nationalists. So we're going to have all that, and it'll be interesting to see how the Irish government deals with that. Because that's going to be quite a big deal, and it's going to require really sort of sensitive planning and inclusion.
And they made games at the start of the year with the RIC coming out.
There's something a wee bit grim about the whole thing, and I think it was summed up for me in the social distance photographs of the government, because you saw everybody scattered across the rooms. Some had masks, some didn't, and you could it was the facial expressions and the eyes. You could just see everybody, what they were thinking about what they just got themselves into. I think that we're in for some interesting years ahead, and I don't think there'll be the criticism of the post-COVID response in the north that there will be in the south, because Stormont kind of just shuffles around money from London at the moment. And also the politicians up here have been very clear. We know that mistakes will have been made. We know that there will be inquiries into this. We know there will have been failures. So they're almost preempting and getting in ahead, that they know that, what will come out on the other side of this will be terrifying, what's been going on while we've all been sort of in lockdown.
Yeah.
There's no tender, there's no procurement process as well as part of the
that was
legislation,
all torn up, yeah.
Which I keep banging. That was all tore up. So we'll be find who the people are that were getting all the millions for all the contracts, and who those people are friends with and related to, and who those people donate to. I think that will be interesting.
Sounds like it's putting American politics to shame.
I'm telling you, because those processes are there for a reason, and when you check all those processes out, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong.
That actually leads on to nicely to our final topic. We have time for one more. Obviously, we've talked a wee bit. Stormont devolution is now back about 8 months. Now, we all thought 2020 was the year when everything was going to get back to normal. It looked like that. We were leaving the European Union at the end of March.
Normal.
we were leaving the European Union. We had that decisive move, and then Stormont came back, and then all of a sudden coronavirus comes. I'm going to go to Tim first on this. This is a hard question, but To get to the end of 2020, do we think we will have at least Stormont functioning at least by that time? Will we see devolution functioning, at least decisions made? Because one of the things about lockdown was the pace of decision making, just the amount of decisions. I mean, they've spent over £1 billion in just 3 months. What do you think?
Well, I think there's a lot of challenges. Once we get through this pandemic, I mean, that's obviously when Stormont's going to really start. I mean, I'm almost reluctant to say this because I don't want to throw another incendiary device in, but Irish language. I mean, how's that gonna all play out? And we're gonna have to have that right. We're gonna have to have Irish language commissioners. We're gonna have to, have all that play out and what that's all gonna mean. And that's going to be that's just going to be a riot day when that happens. And I think if you see all the other things that were coming through from the new decade, new deal, that all have to be implemented. I think the big question is, you say, what did you say? We burned through 3 billion in 3 months.
From Barnett consequences, they got over £1 billion in 3 months.
So we've burned through however many billions. I mean, who's going to pay for this wish list? Of half of it absolute or nonsense. We can't. We've talked about schools already. We've talked about hospital waiting lists. We can't clear the waiting lists, which are going to be 2-3 times as big at the end of this pandemic. And yet, we're going to be paying for this political wish list of nonsense that's going to come out through the pandemic.
Look, so you're not a fan of what Julian Smith and Simon Coveney cobbled together, then?
Well, I think Julian Smith's a magician. He should be getting a medal for what he managed to do. He did a brilliant job. But I think it was just the politics of get this together and then just. Like, lads, it's up to you, away you go, and get this sorted out. It cannot be sorted out. It cannot be paid for. These things are not priorities. Priorities are health and education. We are going to be in an unprecedented medical catastrophe when we come into this. In the days when we had a Stormont functioning, we had a health minister facing normal health crises. We couldn't even clear the waiting lists. I just think where we're headed is not a good place once this pandemic's over.
Any more optimistic, Amanda?
Okay, we always muddle through in some way or another, and I just don't buy into the idea that we have to keep having these arguments. You could set your watch by it. I'm really bored of the cyclical arguments we have. They're like hardy annuals. They pop up at the same times every year, and I think that both Julian Smith and Simon Coveney did a good job to get the show back on the road in January. Nobody was more delighted than I was after spending 3 years of talking about will they, won't they, and then on the actual night itself of being freezing, standing outside Stormont for this big moment. Yes, of course, a lot of it was aspirational, and of course, health is the most important thing. But the Irish language isn't nonsense. Cultural representations of Britishness aren't nonsense. We have to learn that our diversity is our strength. If only people in the North or Northern Ireland, however you choose to view this place, would just get on board with that idea and stop just constantly attacking each other for how their culture and how their identity is manifested, we'd be in a much better place. It could be a big tourism draw. It could be a big boom for all of us. Because really, are we going to keep having literally the same argument for another 50 years? Who cares? If you're British, you're British. If you're Irish, you're Irish. If you're a mixture, fine. If you're none of the above, that's fine as well. It'll be interesting for me how the next couple of elections up here happen and whether we see that middle ground swell. Everybody tries to pretend that, everybody in the Greens and the Alliance, it's just all they don't have a clue what they think about the Constitution, which is absolute nonsense. There's Republicans and Unionists within both of those voting blocks. And I just hope that whenever we get out the other side of this, that there can be a maturity so that we're not distracted about, orange-green nonsense.
Sounds like a man that's making a pitch to carry a banner at the next 12th of July.
I cover the 12th of July without fail.
Cover it in the parade? That sounds like...
I have actually taken part in an orange parade. Whenever I was covering it for the Telegraph years ago, I'd walked to the field the first time round, and then I realised that's quite a distance. So the following year, I jumped on the old timers bus at the back of the parade. I hitched a ride up to the field.
Well, there you go. And Alison, maybe you'll be LOL 727 or something. You'll be swinging the string.
I have probably been to more orange parades than you have. I spent the guts of, 15, 16 years of my life standing at the side of the road from the Tour of the North to the last Saturday watching. I mean, I remember one summer I'd been to so many parades, I was out the back and my neighbours were having a barbecue and I was hanging the washing on the line, and all of a sudden they stopped speaking and I could see them all staring. I realised I was singing the Sish, hanging my washing on the line. I'd heard it that many times because I'd been to so many bloody parades. It was the song in my head at that stage.
Where do you think Stormont is going, apart from you going to parades?
The problem is that what happened, I suppose, with Simon Covey and Julian Smith is they were very crafty. So they told people, give us the most aspirational ideas you can. We're going to put them on this deal, implied that they were going to fund it. And then what they did is, before the politicians had a time to make up their minds, is they walked out and give it to the public. And so it was like, like a game show. It's like, this is what you could win. And, they were showing you the luxury holiday and the Range Rover and everything else. And everyone was like, ooh, we want that. And so the politicians were bounced into it and then quickly realised that there was no money to pay for it. So the problem is that the public voted and, they were delighted that they were back. They were delighted that we were going to have this new decade, new approach deal. And the fact is that immediately it was started on pick, not just because of finances, but immediately because of legacy. So, as part of that deal, it says we're going to implement the Fresh Start. And then Boris Johnson stands up in the Commons and promises veterans that he's going to put an end to prosecutions, which is, is impossible to have the Fresh Start and do that at the same time. His loyalty is always going to be to, the sort of military wing of the Tory party who he's made those promises to. He got favours back for them and favour for what he promised them. So that's going to impact it. I think legacy is always toxic here, and we've already seen that with the Troubles pension, why we had a sort of united front in relation to coronavirus. The minute you started looking at those old issues, you could see where the problems were going to arise straight away. So what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to prioritise. And so we're going to have to say is, we don't have the money to do all the things in this deal, but we do have the money to do X, Y, and Z, and this is what we're going to focus on. So I think that there's issues in relation to infrastructure that really need sorted out. We can't build this place unless we have the correct infrastructure. We're sitting in the middle of West Belfast, need to build casement. That stadium needs to get built. I mean, the fact that it's delayed for as long as it has was a real failure of the previous administrations. Those things I think that they could achieve, but we've got a very short period left. I mean, we've only got till 2022. So they're going to have to commit to this. We're going to have to rebuild an economy. We're going to have to get things back up and running again because after the lockdown, and then look back at that and try and put some sort of shape on the new decade, new approach deal. And I do think that, again, if we ever do have an inquiry, those waiting lists and the people who are waiting cancer screening and all sorts of other things who have now been neglected, I think that the main priority should be for Rowan Swan is to start making sure that that's back up and running, because otherwise people will be dying in far greater numbers than we're seeing them dying now of coronavirus.
I think for the DUP, I think the big problem that they've got, and I think we'll see this play out, and we've actually seen it play out in the last few weeks, is they promised they wouldn't come back into government without a mechanism to deal with parties who wanted to withdraw from the executive so the executive could continue. And we've seen, of course, that whatever window dressing there was in and around, leaders forums and all of these sorts of things, there is no mechanism there that prevents people who want to collapse the institutions from collapsing the institutions. And what we've seen the last few weeks is the DUP have come out and said they will never, under any circumstances, collapse the institutions. So therefore, I think the DUP will find themselves under extreme pressure when the stuff that Alison's talked about, waiting lists, when you're dealing with the legacy issues, when all of those things come to the fore, you'll have one party who'll say, well, we'll walk away, and you have one party who's saying, well, absolutely not. And I think you can see some of the old problems re-emerging.
I don't believe Sinn Féin are ever going to walk away from the Assembly again. I think that was a unique set of circumstances. At this point in time, it benefits them to be inside that system.
I don't agree. I think for Sinn Féin, they'll always have that threat to walk away, and the DUP.
And the thing about the DUP is, you can even see with the Bobby Story, if Arlene Foster wanted to continue on working with Michelle O'Neill, it's their Westminster boys that don't want to.
Well, I don't know about that, but I think once, particularly the legacy issue, what compromise is the DUP going to have to make, because they will never push the nuclear button to walk away, and unless you go into a negotiation and at least have that nuclear button on the table, you're always going to have to compromise. I think it's going to be, that's where the pressure point is going to come for the DUP.
Okay, we have final comment to Amanda.
It's interesting that the DUP is taking that card off the table, because it made such a play of it whenever it was dealing with the London government. I don't know. Like we'll see what happens. If it falls again, it falls, and if it falls again, it may not come back at all. But for now, we're stuck with each other, and the divorce isn't happening just yet.
That's just us in this room. We're stuck with each other, is it?
Not for much longer.
Awesome.
Okay, and that brings us to the end of our Let's Talk Politics segment here at Fela and Fobble. I want to thank my panel, Tim Kearns, Amanda Ferguson, and Alison Morris. Thank you very much for tuning in.